and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. For 2 weeks starting November 11th, negotiators from around the world will be in Baku, Azerbaijan for the 29th annual conference of the parties on climate change known as COP29. Now, they're expected to assess global efforts to advance the Paris Agreement's commitment to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees while addressing a wide range of climate-linked issues. So what's at stake in this year's summit? Joining us on the show now is Khairun Nisa Zabidi, who is director of Nusanterra, a consultancy firm focusing on conservation finance for tropical forests. Khairun, thank you so much for being on the show with me today. I appreciate your time. Now, let's talk about COP28, last year's COP28. It concluded with this historic agreement to phase out fossil fuels. Now, I'm just wondering, if we were to take a look at what's happened since then, how would you assess what's been achieved? And how is this year's COP29, expected to build on the momentum or lack thereof?
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. It's great to be on the show. Thanks for having me. I think broadly, it's great to take a step back and kind of say, what the negotiations are meant to achieve in the first place, right? And I think we saw some great progress in COP28 to kind of especially around building up from COP26, 27, 28. I think it really kind of, we saw a historic sort of shift from commitments to financing. We were having discussions around how we will treat fossil fuels. We're looking at loss and damage. So lots of great building blocks that we're looking at from when we saw COP26 happen in Glasgow. I think that was quite historic because we saw commitments from 20 countries that had net zero commitments to 80 countries by the end of COP26. So we really saw quite a huge political shift of that. What I think Azerbaijan at the moment is there's a lot of conversation around what will happen in Baku, and I think folks are starting to gear up for it. We're going to be seeing people travel from all over the world next week, so big kind of collective moving in. I think there's lots of political commentary around how we see this COP. There's a lot of questions around why Baku. It's such a 90% of their economy is driven from oil and gas exports. Lots of questions around human rights related issues, but I think broadly a lot of political commentary is saying this is sort of a transitional COP before the big COP in Brazil at COP30. But we also saw that for several other landmark COPs, including COP27 as well as COP28. But then we actually did see the commitment of the Loss and Damage Fund happen at COP27, and then leading up to that, the operationalization of the Loss and Damage Fund at COP28. So we're really seeing it as something could come out of Baku. So we shouldn't just slide it away as a transitional COP, because we needing to build that momentum up to what we hope could be really massive commitments. However, considering recent political progress, new developments, I suppose I would say, a lot of questions around how that would impact the COP as well.
What are you concerned about with the political developments? You're referring to, I'm sure, the U.S. elections and the re-election of Donald Trump. As someone within the climate action industry, what are you most concerned about, Khairun?
Yes, so the first time Trump got elected, we saw him pull out the Paris Agreement. So there's big questions around, that's likely going to, that's essentially what's been promised this time around as well. Lots of refocus on domestic related issues, but as the richest country in the world, as well as one of the largest polluting countries, we can't afford to have the US not part of the picture. So it really undermines the UN process more broadly. So yeah, waiting to see this will roll back significant climate progress that we've made over the last few years.
Can we talk a little bit about climate finance? Because I think one of the key focuses this year is going to be setting a new global climate finance target. Talk to me about that. Explain to those of us who may not be following, what are the challenges that this COP is trying to address by setting this new target?
Great, yeah. So I think very broadly, just to explain how climate financing works, essentially, we've built our development trajectory on a very kind of fossil fuel heavy um, uh, underpin, and requiring to shift that, it's either needing to move, like swap out certain parts or swap out the entire system. So that's going to take quite significant finance. We saw 100 billion a year target committed in 2020. And what this means is that it was a political commitment. So essentially, there wasn't any baselining, there wasn't any needs assessment. It was a political target to say Annex 2 countries or developed countries are meant to contribute 100 billion a year to move this shift. And we actually missed it by a couple of years. So it wasn't until 2022 that we actually see that commitment hit. So now we're coming to the end of that commitment period. There's a conversation around something called a new collective quantified goal. So that's NCQG, NCQG. COPs love their acronyms. So here's another one for us to chew on. And so there are conversations around how that will be set. So a lot of it is, I think if we'll scale it down, if we're not looking at it from a UN point of view and scale it down to even a Malaysian context, how much is Malaysia as a country going to need to actually shift or meet our net zero targets? You've got different analysis from different points of view. So a BCG report tells us that we're looking at 450, I think it's something like 450 to 350 to 450 billion needed between 2020 to 2050. That's a BCG report. Our long-term low emissions development strategy cites 2 trillion to achieve net zero. So you can see like there are actually different numbers on how we're actually going to get there. So imagine scaling that to 192 countries and saying, we're going to need some kind of needs assessment to actually baseline how much we're going to need for this new collective quantified goal.
Is that meant to be all decided at COP29? I mean, is this the opportunity to decide how much is needed, who receives it, who pays? Is that all going to be decided within these 2 weeks, or will there be time? Is there a deadline? What's the timeline looking like? It seems like it's a lot of work and a lot of big decisions.
Absolutely. So this is, framing how COPs work. I think very early in the conversation, we talked about progress, right? So typically the host country sets out a framework of how the negotiations would happen. And that includes sort of the subgroups and how, how they would, different checkpoints that they would get to meet before the final negotiations. The final negotiations, essentially, more often than not, is sort of like, we've spent the year negotiating. We've got 3 kind of checkpoints, and we call it intersessionals, like in Bonn and different parts of the world, and then finally coming together to sign this political deal. But often, like a lot of the negotiations, heavy negotiations we see at COP, is sort of the last minute kind of like, is there anything we can change? So for this particular new collective quantified goal, I understand there are 2 countries, Australia and I can't remember the other one, but they've set out a framework of how we will be setting out this quantified goal, this new collective quantified goal, and then negotiations happen within that framework that's set by sort of the appointed countries, I suppose. Right. You'd say.
So what will you be looking out for, Khairun? I mean, in terms of once I guess COP29 is over, the gathering in Baku is over, what will you be looking out for to indicate to you that there is action, particularly on the point of determining these new climate finance targets?
I think there's lots of indicators, right? And again, like scaling it down before we scale it up. So from a Malaysia point of view, how much are we going to need? And again, this is a total net zero target. Primarily, I think a lot of interest is going around nature financing, only because the language that we speak for the other parts, so there's like mitigation, which is how do we transition away from fossil fuels and sort of have heavier investments into new energy or renewable energy. That's a language that the market generally understands. So it makes business sense. And so, we're seeing a very natural transition. We're already seeing renewable energy cheaper than fossil fuels. So that from a financing point of view, it's probably the easier part of the horse to chew, right? But I think the more difficult part is nature financing, primarily because the returns of investments on what nature provides isn't yet calculated or measured in the books. And therefore, if investments are made, then how are we going to see a return? So from a market point of view, seeing flows into finance for nature is probably like going to be quite a big focus of interest. So that's kind of one, baselining where these, like who will receive it. So we're looking at, large multinational organizations. We're looking at bilateral financing. We're looking at multinational multilateral development banks, lots of different sources of financing. But how will that actually get to projects on the ground? So in Malaysia, I managed the country's largest bilateral international climate finance investments once upon a time. So it was a technical assistance kind of program that oversaw sort of five million pounds of financing over a couple of years. And the design of how the financing needs to flow is really critical. And that's delivered like lots of different types of impact here, all the way from policy change to kind of governance, as well as like impact on the ground. But primarily, I think having the question defined at the UN level to say what constitutes as climate finance, where should the finance flow, how should the finance flow, and tagging that to like direct impact on the ground is probably going to be a big bulk of the conversation that's going to be happening at the COP.
All right, well, Khairun, thank you so much for being on the show with me today. That was Khairun Nisa Zabidi from Nusanterra there. We're going to take a quick break here on Consider This. We'll be back with more. Stay tuned. Hi, welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. Let's continue our conversation about what to expect at COP29, the UN Climate Summit that's happening in Baku. Joining us on the show now is Ahmad Afandi Nor Azmi, who is a fellow at the Institute of Strategic and International Studies, Malaysia, where his primary research interests lie in climate resilience, biodiversity, and environmental governance. Afandi, thank you so much for being on the show with me today. I appreciate your time. Let's talk about COP29 reconvening this year, just days after the re-election of Donald Trump as President of the United States. The last time he was in the White House, he withdrew the US from the Paris Agreement. And I wanted to ask you what you think a second Trump administration might mean for global climate negotiations, not just at Baku, but also looking ahead for over the next 4 years he's in office.
Yeah, thanks for having me here. It is remain to be seen, but it is safe to say if Donald Trump is re-elected, it's difficult to be optimistic given what we know. First, Trump has stated that he would withdraw from the Paris Agreement again, just as he did before. Previously, we did not see much of these implications happening because there's a longer process of withdrawal, there's timing of COVID, and Joe Biden re-entering the agreement immediately when his term began. However, now it's already 9 years into the Paris Agreement, so now the withdrawal process is much shorter. Because previously it was about 4 years, now it's taking only 1 year. So if the US were to pull out, the absence will definitely be felt in climate negotiations, as they are the largest historical emitter of greenhouse gas emission, and the absence will reduce accountability and undermine the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, where developed nations are actually expected to lead on reducing emissions and giving support for developing countries. And second, Trump actually has signaled the plans to expand fossil fuel production. And even ironically, oil and gas production actually continued even under Biden, where the US was the world top producer of oil and gas. But at least there were regulations in place to speed up transition to cleaner energy source, such as Inflation Reduction Act, power plant rule. But it's likely that Trump could dismantle these efforts as he did during his first term, where he rolled back hundreds of environmental regulation and policies. And this would definitely increase the GHG emissions and affect more vulnerable countries. And I think lastly, for this particular COP, we must consider the effect on climate finance. So the US has been one of the largest funders of the UNFCCC and United Nations in general. And this year's COP, there's a new goal on climate finance on the table. And the news of Trump winning the election and the US potentially stepping back will now cast a shadow over the negotiations, where actually countries now need to decide on the new quantum and contribution to the new finance goals. So for now, I think we will see for this COP and over the next few years, other nations may now see less reason to maintain or increase their climate commitments. So in a nutshell, we risk unraveling years of hard-fought progress, where at the time where we can least afford it.
Yeah, that's the focus on climate finance is particularly interesting in this COP, and I'm just wondering, what else are you watching out for, Afandi, in terms of what might be the top agenda items at COP29? Are you looking out for anything in particular?
Yeah, there's quite a few, but I think I really have to emphasize back on the finance. And this biggest agenda, it remains the new collective quantified goal for climate finance. And there's a reason why this COP is being called the Finance COP. So it's been previously agreed by parties that there will be a new goal on climate finance before 2025 to increase finance flows for mitigation and adaptation from developed countries. So this goal is actually an update or a revision of a previous goal of 100 billion USD per year, and they need to suppress it. And with UN agencies and the civil society organization estimate that trillions of dollars actually needed annually. But again, I have to emphasize that this issue has been very contentious. One, because developed countries have mostly failed to achieve that 100 billion target annually. And even that, 70% of this finance comes in form of loans and not really grants and funds. So that actually increased the debt burden of vulnerable countries that are already affected by disasters and climate change, right? And second, even in previous negotiations, parties have continuously failed to define a quantum. And again, there was a push by developed nations now to expand the contribution base of this new goal to include developing nations such as Malaysia. So that's this red line now where I think countries are negotiating on what should be the equitable financing mechanism. So that's one. Another agenda is a bit technical. It's on Article 6 of the carbon market, which is really focused on finalizing the bilateral and international carbon markets under the Article 6.2 and 6.4. But basically, it means that countries can now trade carbon with each other. But again, over the years, I think countries have they failed to reach consensus due to technical disagreement on issues such as who should authorize it, who should regulate it, and how you quantify emission reduction, and is there an additionality to these emission reductions. But I think the good news is there is an increasing pressure, especially from the Azerbaijan presidency to resolve these issues and really start operationalizing this Article 6 at COP29. Other agenda we can look at is perhaps the new nationally determined contribution. Is basically countries supposed to submit the new updated climate commitments under the Paris Agreement next year. So this is very important following the first global stocktake that was done last year at COP28, where they underscores that action is not good enough, ambition is not good enough, and there's a need for greater ambition to limit warming below 1.5 degrees C. But if I may speak a bit on Malaysia, I think personally, I think we should look out for a few agenda. One is access to the loss and damage fund, where by right countries should be compensated for damages related to climate change beyond mitigation and adaptation. And again, ensuring our adaptation needs are reflected in the new goal for new global goal on adaptation that should be discussed this year as well. And again, addressing response measures. This is such as unilateral trade measure, such as the EU carbon border adjustment mechanism, and emphasize the need for multilateral process. Again, countries that will be unfairly impacted by these trade tactics.
Right. Afandi, can I ask you? I mean, every COP there's always lots of ambitious targets that are announced. I mean, last year's COP was triple renewable energy capacity, double the rate of energy efficiency, phase out fossil fuels. Fantastic headlines, but how much momentum is there really between the COPs? And now we're coming into COP29. Have we made a lot of momentum? What's your assessment of how much progress is made in between COPs, and if what we can realistically expect out of COP29?
I think again, COP usually is a process, right? It's not just
it's not one meeting.
It's not just one meeting. There's actually a lot of process and meetings happening between from the previous COP all the way to the next year's COP. So there's lots of momentum carried forward. You might not see it explicitly in headlines, but previously there was so much of discussions and negotiation happening. But to see the success of this COP, I think that's a very difficult one. But I would say in the context of this COP and consider the landscape we are in, successful climate action for me is on one agenda, honestly, which is to have the equitable climate finance goal that see that developed nations fulfill their financial obligation and should be increasing their contribution to support developing countries. So it's not just by quantum or amount, actually. I think previously India called for at least USD 1 trillion per year from developed country, but actually a more realistic estimation should be around USD 5.8 trillion annually up to 2050 to support all 152 developing countries. Again, I think that's looking at your face and mine, that's a really tall order to get approval. Even Azerbaijan official has said that maybe hundreds of billions has a more realistic chance of getting consensus. But for me personally, it's not just the amount, but also the form and delivery of the finance. It's not just, like I said, to debt, but to grants, concessional finance and funds. And there need to be a accountability, consideration, and whether this contribution represent new and additional funds, not double tagging from previous funds, right? And especially where should we go to, especially in regards to adaptation, the need to cope with climate change impacts, rather than just mitigation to reduce emission, as well as loss and damage fund. And there needs to be the fund need to have measurable outcomes and impact, and ensuring that the needs of the most vulnerable community, indigenous communities, are taken into account across all these areas. But again, I think I don't want to be a bit of pessimist here, but realistically, it's hard to achieve all of this. One, we are in extremely turbulent period when it comes to geopolitics and global climate governance. The results of US election will loom over the negotiation now. And in fact, I think the result of US election probably have bigger implication on COP than COP itself. And alongside major crises such as genocide in Gaza, what's happening in Congo and Sudan. And so I think at this moment, what you said, the momentum have been carried forward, but over the years, I can tell that the principle of the equity and common but differentiated responsibilities under the Paris Agreement are severely being tested. And a lot of people actually this year are sort of overlooking this year's COP. But I still think it's crucial to pay attention to the finance outcome, and also given the recent development, which will impact all the COPs near future. Right, what happened is COP will carry the momentum forward until COP next year in Brazil. At a time where a global climate action is really needed, where we already reached multiple tipping points, and actually we only have latest science said that you only have 4 years left to limit warming below the 1.5 degrees C, and even that we have to reduce emission by 19% every year up to 2030 to have a chance. So I think even this COP may not be as big as last year or next year's COP, but the stake has never been higher.
Yeah. Can I just very quickly ask you, there's been quite a lot of talk or concerns around the selection of Azerbaijan as the host country. And I wanted to ask you about the importance of the host country of COP. This is the third time, I think COP29 is the third time that you have a significant oil producing company, fossil fuel producing country that is hosting the conference. How much does that actually influence the tone and the priorities of COP29? And does the choice of host country matter?
Yes, it does to some extent. But first of all, I think we have to put this in the context of the Azerbaijan is actually part of the COP presidency's troika that was established under the UAE consensus involving UAE, Azerbaijan and Brazil to collectively working under this mission to 1.5 degrees C initiative. So this is especially critical after the first global stocktake, which emphasized the need for more cooperation and ambition for the next round of nationally determined contributions, but also building continuity and coherence between these three presidencies from COP28 to this year's COP and next year's COP. I do understand your questions that there is some criticism from subsides and oil and gas producing country hosting COP such as Azerbaijan, given their continued reliance on fossil fuel and expansion of fossil fuel. It's valid to some extent, but it's important to remember that their status as a developing countries. So even the UNFCCC framework recognized the unique role of oil and gas producing countries and their national circumstances. So hence, this always emphasizes the need for just transition, that we need to balance climate goals, but with also economic and social realities of the nation. and the fact that there's also need for equitable representation of both global North and global South in the global climate action. So anyway, I think I get the criticism, but I think in a way this is opportunity to demonstrate or showcase how developing nations such as Azerbaijan could push for more ambitious climate action, but also reflecting the realities of developing and fossil fuel producing nation, including Malaysia. Yeah.
Absolutely. Afandi, thank you so much for being on the show with me today. Ahmad Afandi Nor Azmi there from the Institute of Strategic and International Studies, Malaysia, wrapping up this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching. Good night.